Designers don't want to just accept the world the way it is. We actually want to change the world. We realize that we don't have all the answers as designers, that we're going to get pushed back. Everybody keeps talking about China as the country to watch. But I keep telling people, I think India, over the long term, is going to be the country to watch, not China. A lot of design activity is focused on the needs of the middle class, and the signal of the village has gone way down. So essentially, design reconfigures what's already there to actually create better value. We're not really thinking about the value of design.
Hello and welcome to Design Darshan. Today we are joined by our very own Professor Adam Kallish. Adam, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Adam, and I'm from Chicago, Illinois, in the center of the United States. I'm a human being, and I want to make a difference in the world, and I think design is a great platform to do it. I'm an accidental designer. I didn't plan to be a designer. It wasn't something that was a burning desire when I was young. I fell into it, like many designers, because I didn't want to do science. And I, by accident, wanted to do cartography, because cartography was an extension of geology. I was a geology major. And they didn't have a map-making program at my university. And so somebody said, well, go on over to the design program and see if you'd be interested in going to design. And I went over there and I had a great conversation, and I went into a traditional foundation program, and I never looked back. And that's where I am today.
So geology seems so much different from design. Like, are there any things that were in geology that you were able to transfer to design?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Geology is really about systems that dynamically change over time. Very, very slowly. We're talking millions of years. And it's a lot about observation, because in geology you're observing natural landscapes that have tectonic forces underneath the ground. And so you're trying to understand how these tectonic forces shaped what you're actually looking at. And a lot of it is inferential. So you're looking at things and it's inferring natural processes underneath the ground that you can't see. So I had to actually learn how to really observe and ask very critical questions about what I observed, and then do research to actually find the answers. And so I see a lot of parallels between the hard sciences, which is looking for structure and is thinking in terms of systems, and what designers do with human beings in terms of the natural environments and the man-made environments that they actually create, which is what Don Norman talks about. I mean, Don Norman says that everything that we consider normal is artificial. Everything. But yet, how do we get ourselves out of the acclimation of the familiar and actually realize that all these things are man-made? Everything that you see in this room, that we wear, that we interact with, are all artificial. And when you start to think that way, you begin to realize that there's nothing intuitive or natural about our world, because we created all this stuff. It wasn't naturally created. So there are similarities to geology in terms of systems and trying to understand how things change over time. But there are things that are very different, because in geology, you're dealing with inanimate objects. You're dealing with ground forces, tectonic plates, where in design, you're dealing with people and people systems. So that would be the difference from geology.
So as someone, who was born and brought up in Chicago and who is now in India, what have you observed about India in terms of, systems and people? And what do you think India has to offer that any other country doesn't?
It's difficult to describe India. It's probably difficult to describe the United States too. The United States is familiar to me. Obviously, I grew up in it, just like you grew up in India. Yeah, when I came to India in 1990, India was a very different country. It was centrally planned. There was a lot of scarcity. The middle class only made up, I think, probably about 1 or 2% of the whole population. There was a lot of poverty in India. India has a very unique history. It's much older, obviously, than the United States. You have many different types of cultures here in the United States. It was pretty much conquered by the English or the French. There were only a few occupying powers, where India has had many, many occupying powers over the centuries. You have many languages here. In the United States, we're monolingual, even though we do have different regional variations. So India, to me, was an interesting case study of how does all this diversity work together as one country. And I think even though India is an old country, really your independence in 1947, after many centuries of being occupied, really made it a young country in many ways. In 35 years since I first came to India to now, I've seen a huge market change in India. India used to be very insecure about itself in terms of its image of itself. I think it was controlled for so long that India wasn't sure what it was. 35 years later, I think India is finally realizing we're proud to be Indian. We don't have to apologize to be Indian. We can compete on a world stage like any other country. The middle class has grown. It's exploded to like 30% of the population. There's what I call the desire economy, where consumption is everywhere. There's money sloshing everywhere in India. Everywhere I go, there's money. And that's very different than in 1990, where there was no money. Now I'm seeing consumerism, mass consumption, which brings up a lot of issues, obviously. But I think India now, everybody keeps talking about China, as the country to watch. But I keep telling people, I think India over the long term is going to be the country to watch, not China. Now you're seeing more and more investment, in India by multinational corporations. And I think because India is a democracy, I think it's a much more dynamic economy than you're finding in China. And I think it's going to have a higher growth rate in terms of economic growth than China. China's slowing down. I think India is going to have a much more sustained growth rate, which will have huge impacts on the practice of design in this country.
Can you elaborate on what those impacts in design would be? Like, how do all these factors that you just mentioned about India, how does that change the way you design for an Indian context versus an American context?
Yeah. Well, when Charles Eames came here in the 1950s, he was brought over to actually visit India by the Sarabhai family, which is an old textile family in Ahmedabad. He traveled India just like I did when I came here, and he wrote a report. It was called the Eames Report. And in the Eames Report, he identified two key things. One, he identified the lota, which is just a vessel, as probably the most Indian thing he could identify that was from India. Nobody knows who the designer was of the lota. It was designed by many people over many centuries, but he held that up, that simple form, as probably the epitome of Indian design. So that was the first thing he did. The second thing he did was he said that India needed an Institute of Design to be created to actually train designers. Very early on, there was this connection between the social dimension of design and helping people at the village level improve their agency and improve their lives. And that set in motion at NID, when I was there, many decades of focusing on improving rural village life, access to water, access to contraception, access to electricity, to utilities, things of that nature. And I think that really shaped what design was probably for 50 years. But I think because of the rise of the middle class in India, design very much is a middle class activity. Design was originally created in the 1850s when it was defined in a modern way to actually help improve the products the middle class consume. And so I think what's happening now in India is that a lot of design activity is focused on the needs of the middle class, and the signal of the village has gone way down. I don't really hear a lot about design at the village level anymore. I hear about design at the multinational, which are corporations. And I hear about products and services that are geared to the middle class, like Swiggy or Blanket or other services, digital services, for example, that the middle class want to consume that defines middle class lifestyle. So I think that's a huge change, is that I think design is really focusing on what I call the desire economy. And that's where the money is. That's where the resources are. And I'm not seeing as much of design for the need economy, which is really the people who are not served at all, or the underserved, which is what I talk about, which is the want economy. These are the people that are earning a little bit more money, but they're not middle class yet. They have middle class aspirations.
So something that I find really interesting is the difference between American consumers and the Indian middle class consumers. American consumers, they have different needs, right? And so do Indian consumers. And as an Indian consumer myself, I always look for the cheapest and the most convenient option. Whereas I guess the American consumer looks more for like the luxurious option or something that is much, elevated than a usual service. So how do we as designers sort of decide what aspect of the consumer to serve?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, it's true that American consumerism is older than Indian consumerism, but not by much. America didn't really have consumerism until after World War II, because there was this thing called the Great Depression, which obviously affected the whole world. There was no money, there was no work. It was a horrible time for about 20 years. But after World War II, when the Nazis got defeated, it opened up a whole explosion in terms of economic development that went from the war effort to the post-construction effort around the world. And the United States consumers were sort of created. It was all this pent-up demand for cars and washing machines and all sorts of stuff. But I would say that American consumers aren't more sophisticated than Indian consumers, actually, because they both have a lot of things in common, which is they have enough capital, they have enough resource to fulfill their desires. Their wants are taken care of. All their wants are taken care of. Once your wants are taken care of, you move to your desires. I want to get a car. I want to get a washer. I want to go on vacation. I want nice clothes. These are things that aren't core to your life from a needs perspective. They're your wants. They're the things that give you identity. And I think that design, whether it's in the United States or design in India, goes back to what I talked about in terms of the desire economy, is that I think that we're playing to people's desires or things that they don't think that they want or need, but actually are being advertised as something that they want or need because it's an aspiration. So we're actually creating aspirations for people to have a fulfilled life. But there's a edge to that, which is the more we consume, the less we feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
So a lot of people actually feel emptier the more they consume, rather the more fulfilled they feel. So this is something that design has to grapple with, which is we want to help people live better lives, whatever that means, whether you're in the desire economy, the want economy, or the need economy. But we also have to be very careful about the effects of our activities in terms of the human psyche, in terms of fulfillment or human agency. So going back to your question is I don't think that American consumers are actually that much more sophisticated or are looking only for luxury. There's a lot of people in the United States that are middle class, lower middle class, and they're searching for value, just like the Indian consumer would search for value. They don't want to spend a ton of money, but they want to get more in return for what they spent.
So as you were just saying, how designers promote the consumerist mindset, do you think designers are ethical for doing that? Because, they are creating more aspirations, and while they might improve quality of life, like you just said, that's also taking away from a lot of their life too.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Design ethics. It's like saying, is there business ethics? Technically, there is, but actually, if you look at capitalism, capitalism is supposed to be amoral, because if we included all the moral dimensions of things, a lot of capitalism wouldn't work. Like inequity, for example, that isn't fair. But capitalism depends on inequity. It depends on people who have more and people who have less. Designers are very much part of that. Like you said, we are there to support the capitalist system. We're there to support the needs and wants of corporations who sell products and services to people like yourself. I would say that design is an applied art, which means it has to have utility value versus a fine art. And I would say that most designers probably don't think too much about the ethical dimension of what they do. But I would say that there are more and more designers that are asking questions about the impact of their activity on a lot of things that you're talking about. Is it good that we have 50 different brands of toothpaste, or 20 different brands of cars? Is that really necessary? So I think we are starting to ask ourselves some of the questions and saying, does design need to create a whole new thing? Like Don Norman talks about, do we really need another app? Right? He talks about that. So I think design should start to ask these higher order questions, because we do impact society, but I think we see it as like an externality, like that's somebody else's problem to deal with, or somebody else will deal with that. We just have to fulfill the short-term request, which is to create something that people want. So I think it's starting to happen. I don't think it's happening enough. But I think given all the problems that we're seeing in the world in terms of global warming, in terms of inequity all over the world, I think design is starting to finally realize, hey, we are part of the problem. How can we become part of the solution? But there's no easy answer to that at all. There isn't.
You said something really interesting, that is there a need for another app? And this brings me back to something that I had a conversation with about someone else, is that a lot of the times when you're working in a big corporate, you're working on top of someone else's work and you're improving that work. And then when we're not creating new things, we're improving things. So how do we as designers go about such a situation?
Yeah, it's funny. Design is always associated with the new, but actually most of design is improving what's already there. That's really what the bulk of design does. And there's nothing wrong with that. So essentially design reconfigures what's already there to actually create better value. So for example, how do we make things more understandable? We're not creating new understanding. We're just taking things that are already there that are complicated to understand, and we're reconfiguring them in a simplified way for people to actually be able to consume that product or service in a much better way to get more value. So I think a lot of design is just reconfiguring what's already there. There's nothing wrong with that. I think a lot of things just need a simple tweak in order to make it better. And I don't think designers should feel, oh, that's too constraining, for example. Then there's innovation. And innovation isn't necessarily about the new, but it's about shifting the value in a more dramatic way to actually create more value than just tweaking around the edges. And I think that's the interesting space for design to be in, is to actually push in a more aggressive way to actually get greater value by not just reconfiguring things, but actually adding new capabilities to things that already exist. And you guys have done this within just a short amount of time here at BITS, where you actually worked on real problems that real people were having. Some of your things were reconfiguring what was already there, but there were things like we're bringing these things in that didn't even exist to actually create even more value. And then the highest order is invention, where you're actually inventing something that didn't exist before. And that happens very, very rarely in design. Design is going to be that transformational. Not saying it hasn't happened. Like even the iPhone, for example, which everybody says, oh, that was such an innovative or cutting edge or inventive product. It actually was just a reconfiguration of many technologies that had already existed. It just reconfigured it and put it into a new form factor. The form factor had never existed before. So that was the invention. But all the technologies that were in that form factor had been around for years. It just was reconfigured in a new way. So I think design should concern itself less with, is this a simple reconfiguration? Is this an innovation? Or is this an invention? And just try to solve the problem, but do it in a way that provides the best value for people.
So you're into service design, right? Mm-hmm. And this is something that isn't really offered as a course in many universities, at least in India. And, we have product design, we have industrial design, communication design, but service design isn't something that's really taught. Why do you think that is, A? And B, how do you think that it can be promoted more and taught in a better way?
Yeah, I think what you hear a lot all over the world is experience design, or how to create experiences. And what is an experience? An experience is something consumed over time. It's very process-driven. It's very protocol-driven. That's why we have experiences. Okay? Service design was defined in the 1980s by a woman, Lynn Shostak. And she wrote an article in Harvard Business Review called, I think, Designing Services That Matter. I think that's what, and she was not a designer at all. And so she actually was very interested in how does the service get delivered? And there's a lot of back-end processes that people don't see that are impacting what is seen. So her big innovation was trying to link the unseen processes with actually what people actually experience, and actually putting them together and saying this is a whole system that has to be thought of as a system in order to be delivered seamlessly to people who don't care about what's behind the curtain, but what's behind the curtain is impacting the things that is in front of the curtain, okay? So service design started to take off in the 90s, but it's funny, it was more adopted in Europe than in the United States. So even though it was invented in the United States, as actually European design schools and European universities that actually took service design, formalized it, and one of the biggest users of service design in Europe were governments, was how to improve government services. So they actually created design capabilities within governments to actually rethink the way, for example, how people got healthcare, or how social services were delivered in a more efficient way, in a more human-centered way. So instead of it being seen as a handout, right, government services, or something that's just sort of given to people that who really cares because it's free through our taxes, they said, why don't we actually create services that actually help people's agency and actually helps improve the way they actually get the service. So the reason why you really don't hear about service design is that it's become regionalized in Europe. I think, though you are starting to see service design get more visible internationally through the Service Design Network, the SDN, that's the professional organization for service design. And I think the service design model, which is using the Cooper model, the Cooper model is the front of the stage, the back of the stage, is a very simple and understandable way to structure an experience. So a lot of people who say, oh, I'm in experience design, the first thing I ask them, what is experience design? And they look at me like a deer with headlights. They don't know how to answer. They're like, well, an experience. I'm like, well, you can't use the name in the answer. So what goes into an experience? And I say, well, how you feel and what you see. And I'm like, well, you're getting closer, but I still don't understand what an experience is. So I think the nice thing about service design focuses on how all of our senses work together in order to have some sort of value that's delivered to us through our actions, through our interactions with systems. Systems can be people, can be communications, can be objects, and how all of these things are coordinated in a seamless way for us to get the value. Because in the end, we don't really care about the mechanics of the service. We just want the value. But we do value when we get good service. We remember good service, but we also remember bad service. Yeah, and that's just true in general. We remember the bad more than we remember the good. So I think service design, you'll start to see it become more visible, but it's regionalized, unfortunately.
So in like India, do you think, since again we don't have like a career called service design, like who do you think are the people doing service design? Because services certainly exist in India.
Absolutely.
And there has to be people doing, like designing these services, but they're not called service designers. So who do you think is doing them right now?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. That's just the short answer. I would say that the designers that I talk to that are creating services, because they do use the word service, but I don't hear the word service design, are addressing the front of the stage and the back of the stage, but they don't call it those things. So they understand the concept of service design, but they don't understand the concepts behind service design. And I think that's the disconnect.
I see.
So I think that they immediately talk about look and feel. They immediately talk about, what the brand is, for example, but they don't really go in deeper into that. They look at the surface issues rather than the underlying motivations that people have or should have when they consume a product or service. For example, Zomato, the food app, they actually had a video that somebody put together about Zomato, but they used the service design model to deconstruct Zomato, for example. So they sort of retrofit service design, trying to rationalize all the decisions that Zomato made in terms of their platform. And so I would say that I would hope that more service designers from different countries actually come to India and actually talk more about it. I do know that the Service Design Network probably has many Indian practitioners who are actually learning what service design is and then talking to other people in India about service design. So I think it's a great opportunity, but I don't really see the signal yet.
So to me, service design seems very technical, logical, methodical, whereas the perception of design in India is that it's like commercialized art.
Mm-hmm.
So how does creativity play a role in service design?
Yeah, service design is meant to be systematized. So you're absolutely correct. It is based upon the logical progression of how people act with information and objects and systems and data over time to complete some sort of transaction in order to get value, for the person to get value. I would say not just in India, internationally, design is not associated with that. Design is associated with creativity and imagination. But I would say in service design, they also recognize there is an emotional component to a service experience. Because when you have a bad experience, you get angry. Yeah. When you have a good experience, you actually either get excited or you feel satisfied. So I would say that service design, even on the surface, it sounds very logical because you have the front of the stage, you've got the back of the stage, you have the 5 E's. That is one dimension of service design. But how are people feeling when they're actually going through the service experience? Are they stressed? Are they happy? Are they satisfied? Are they unsatisfied? Are there gaps in time where people get frustrated? So a lot of service designers that I respect aren't just addressing the logical portion of what you're talking about. They're also looking for the emotional dimension of the situation and are trying to then integrate emotional and logical together, because I think you need both. Mm-hmm. You need logic and you need emotion. But we are emotionally driven as human beings, but we use logic as a way to keep our emotion in check. That's why we have logic. So I think on the surface, it sounds like they're separate, but I would say for really good service designers that I know who practice it, actually try to integrate the emotional dimension with the logical dimension to deliver a unified experience.
So we just talked about the emotional aspect and how it's very, very important for service design. But then how do we keep our personal biases out of it? Because emotion is a very subjective thing, and when we look at logic, it's easy to take that emotion out of it. It's easy to ignore that. But then when we're trying to address emotional things, it's hard to keep our own emotions out of it, right? So how do we as designers do that?
Well, I would say the reason why a lot of things in the world don't work is that we think too logically. We don't take the emotional dimension into account. So it looks great on paper. It sounds very logical, but then when you actually release it, people actually have to use it. And then people get all emotional about the thing that was released and it doesn't work. And I've seen it over and over again in design and problems I've actually brought in to actually help solve. And say, well, this should work logically, but actually when we release it, people hate it. People don't want to use it. So I actually have to go out and actually see them actually use these things. And then I realize that their emotional needs aren't being met. Technically, they're being met, but the emotion has been left out. Now, in terms of bias just means your worldview,
Right.
your particular worldview versus your particular worldview. And that's based on many, many factors, social, political, economic, a lot of other factors. And I think that what makes designers honest or keeps us honest is that we have to socialize and collaborate our concepts with people. We don't just work in a silo by ourselves. If we just work by ourselves, we would be trapped in our own bias and our own echo chamber. But because a lot of design is collaborative to begin with, we actually have to work with people who also have opinions, who also have biases. So we actually have to align and stress test our biases together to get to what I call a shared agreement.
Sure.
So that shared agreement actually takes, hopefully, enough of the bias out where we actually are able to deliver something that has been stress tested and is more useful to people. Rather than this is something that I think people need, but it's only based on only my perspective. So I think this is something that keeps design in check is the ability to have to collaborate with many different fields in order to deliver value. But I think there's always going to be bias. You cannot get rid of bias. It's just impossible.
But even in the case that you mentioned where we're collaborating with other designers, then they're all still designers. Or in this case, like, in college, when we work on a project, we're working together with our peers who, again, they have their own biases. They all have different perspectives.
Sure.
But none of us have any perspective close to, again, talking about the project that we did, like the counter person at a street side cafe.
Mm-hmm.
None of us will ever have that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that we can get that perspective and that worldview into our designs?
Well, part of it was what you did. You actually went out into the field. You observed first, right? We didn't even call it a problem. Remember we said that we used the word situation. I didn't use the word problem because that immediately would have put you in a mindset that there's a problem to be solved. I said, go out and observe. You did. You then, after you observed, you had lots of questions about what you observed. Then you developed a series of questions because I was like, well, I don't understand why they're doing that, or I've never seen that before. So then you actually went and talked to them about why were they doing that, or why did they do that? You're trying to understand their mental model of the world. And then from the interviews and the observation, then you developed a series of hypothesis sort of statements, and you actually went out and said, okay, I'm going to run this test and see whether my hypothesis actually is quote unquote true. And in your case, in your team's case, it wasn't.
Yeah.
You remember the fateful phone call. And then it was like, okay, you didn't fail. It was take the actual data that actually proved your hypothesis false and rewrite your hypothesis to match the data, which sounds like it's cheating, but it wasn't cheating at all. You just got greater insight into the problem. And then all of that together created a much more informed problem statement through the insights that you have. The other thing I want to correct is that designers shouldn't only collaborate with designers.
Right.
I didn't say designers. I just said collaborators.
Fair enough.
So a lot of designers actually collaborate with non-designers, subject matter experts, for example, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, lawyers, doctors, people in public health. So these are subject matter experts that actually bring their technical skills and their life experiences, and we bring the human-centered aspect to the table because we want to increase people's agency. And we all have to socialize our different biases and our different perspectives to get agreement on what the problem is and what the possible responses are. So design has to work with many other fields because the problems that we're dealing with are very complicated. They're almost like on the border of being wicked. There's a thing called wicked problems, which is where there's no agreement on the boundaries of the problem. There's no agreement on what the problem even is.
Can you give an example of those?
Global warming is a wicked problem. It's a total wicked problem. It goes to the fundamentals of human activity and the artificial world that we've created. People are all over the board. Now we're collecting data, right, in terms of the factual aspects of global warming. It has such an impact on everybody that everybody has their own agenda on what the answer should be to global warming. And so that's one of the biggest wicked problems that we have, and we're not doing a very good job of addressing global warming.
You mentioned how we as designers are supposed to work with all different types of people who are involved in that situation. But always there is a situation where a conflict of interest arises. So how do we deal with such a conflict of interest where like the stakeholder knows that they need to change, but they aren't willing to change?
Yeah, everybody's for change as long as it doesn't impact them. So I think you've seen that, in some of the classes you've taken. I think the first thing is trust. If you don't have trust with the people either that you're collaborating with or the people that you're trying to help, they're always going to look at what you're doing with suspicion, and they're not going to want to accept your perspective, even though your perspective could actually help, because they don't have trust in you. So I think one of the things that I always try to stress whenever I collaborate is how do we show each other that we can trust each other? How do we show that I have something to give, just like you have something to give? And there's going to be times when we disagree, but that's okay. The disagreement doesn't have to be existential in terms of it's I'm 100% right or you're 100% right. It doesn't have to be that way. We both are right. We both are wrong. I think the goal of collaboration is we have to negotiate our different views of a situation and learn and realize that we don't have all the answers. So if we realize we don't have all the answers and we have blind spots in our thinking, even I do, then that's where you can feel vulnerable to people. But you can only feel vulnerable if you trust people. If you don't trust people, you don't want to show vulnerability because that shows weakness. Right. So one of the biggest challenges that I see in working collaboratively is that they focus on the mechanical or the logical aspects of collaboration rather than addressing the emotional dimensions of collaboration. And so a lot of what I focus on in team building, et cetera, is addressing the emotional needs of teams as well as the technical individual contributor, logical aspect of teams, because you need both in order for it to work. So I think designers need to get out of their comfort zone in terms of what I call psychological safety, which is I want to feel safe and I don't want to feel threatened at any point. Well, that's impossible. So I think that psychological safety is important, but it can't dictate every interaction because otherwise you're not going to grow as a person. So I think feeling uncomfortable is okay. That doesn't mean that you're losing your sense of agency or that you're going to feel threatened. I think it just means that you're opening yourself up to a world of possibilities that you just never considered before. And if it makes you feel a little uncomfortable, I think that's the only way you know you're growing. Right. So I think that designers need to feel more discomfort in collaborating and realize that we don't have all the answers as designers, that we're going to get pushback. But pushback shouldn't be seen as negative. It just means we didn't make our case well enough, or it means that we don't have enough trust in the people that we're collaborating with, and we've got to develop that trust account.
So is this trust that, like, our trust in them or them trusting us? as to like our intentions being genuine? And if it is the other way around, how do you get other people to trust you?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of professions are sleepwalking. Essentially, they are. If you look at law or medicine or other areas, they sort of see the world as normal and it's just the way the world works, where designers have a tendency to ask why a lot. And when you ask why, it sort of takes aim at things that people say, well, this is the way it is. Why are you asking why? We should just accept it the way it is. Designers don't want to just accept the world the way it is. We actually want to change the world. So I think what we need to do more of is more listening and trying to show that we can be responsible stewards when we collaborate versus being seen as confrontational by asking the why all the time. Sometimes I think we need to sort of take small steps in order to develop that trust, in order to show that we could deliver some value, and that we don't necessarily need to go from modification to invention, right? Because invention means you're doing something completely new.
Right.
I think a lot of times designers need to say, well, this may take several iterations to get to the point that I want us to be. And I'm willing to give that up in order for us to make more progress, because the problem that we're working on is way too complicated for me alone to solve it. Mm-hmm. I need all these people around me. Yeah. So I'm willing to stair-step progress over time in order to make it more palatable versus trying to do it in one swoop, which never really works in the first place. In any situation that you experience as a human being, if you're thrown into something and saying, okay, by the end of the day, this has to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Your stress level is going to go way up, especially if it's something fairly dramatic, and you're going to freak out the whole day, and you're going to fight it every step of the way. We've all experienced that. Versus if I say, you have 3 weeks to do this, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, oh, well, that's 3 weeks. It's not like tomorrow. Yeah. And so then you develop a plan of stair-stepping the change over the 3 weeks where it seems achievable. I think that's the big thing is what's achievable, and achievable is different than desirable. I think that's the key critical thing here. Yes, we have a desired endpoint that we want to get to, but what can we actually achieve in that time? Right. And you're going to get a very different answer than what's desired.
So on another note, obviously, you had a very long career in design and you've seen how the world changed. What do you see as the future of design? What are your hopes? What are your predictions?
Well, part of me is optimistic about design and part of me is very pessimistic about design. I'll start with the pessimism. Design is getting commoditized. I see it here in India. The good news is that design has exploded in India compared to 1990. 1990, there were only 3 design programs. Now there's supposedly over 2,000 design programs. I think that's an overestimation, obviously. But what I do see is that I see a lot of parents who are now much more open to their children going into design, where in 1990, parents fought their children getting into design. So they're like, that isn't a real field. Nobody makes any real money in it. It's not viable, you know, in terms of a career. Now, when I came here to some college nights, parents were dragging their children to be designers. I thought I was like in an alternative universe. So I think the good news is that design has exploded. But the bad news is the same answer as that design has exploded, is that design, everybody wants it, but they want it just for the creativity and the production of these artifacts. And they're not really thinking about the value of design. They're just thinking about production. So that's the pessimistic part, is that I think design has trapped itself into the creativity to production model. And I'm not saying that isn't needed, and you do need some of that. But if that defines all of design, then we're essentially being moved downstream where we can't ask the bigger questions. Right. Because they're like, why are you asking those questions? I just want you to get creative and then bang it out.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's the pessimistic part of me, is that design won't let go of creativity and objects, okay, because it's so ingrained in us. Now, on the other side, I'm very excited about design moving into, for example, data. We live in a world of data. So there's an actual area called computational design, which is really trying to understand the structure of data and actually trying to design the data sets to actually become interoperable to work within digital systems, for example. So that's a big area that I think has huge potential. I also think service design,
Right.
And I keep hyping on it because I think it's something that can bridge a lot of what we talked about today, in terms of creating greater agency for people who consume products and services, because products and services, as you know, are now coming together. Products are no longer just products because they're instrumented. They actually have microchips in them, and data is flowing into the microchip, which is affecting the product. And services are getting productized. So, for example, Swiggy and Zomato and Blinkit and all of these new companies that have been created in India are actually productized systems.
Right.
How do you take something that's idiosyncratic and actually systematize it and use physical digital that work together in order to deliver value? So that's the opportunity that I see for design, but the problem is I don't see design interested in that.
Oh.
And I think that's where I think that's design and other design programs in India, I think could actually make a difference, is to elevate those into something that has value, that can be taught, that actually can provide new types of value, but it's going to take a heavy lift. And it's even true in the United States, but less in Europe, because Europe, I think, is more on board on this, where designers are actually realizing, hey, I can be creative and imaginative, but within a systems envelope to actually create greater change. So that's my hope for design, but I'm a realist at the same time. And I think it's going to take maybe 1, 2, or 3 generations. And I think AI is forcing the conversation, because AI is automating many things, and it's going to automate a lot of design. So a lot of what we associate with design today, which takes into account the creativity and imagination and the object, they're all just rule sets, and so we're already seeing it. And so a lot of designers are like, well, if Midjourney or Wall-E or whoever can essentially make these things with no human intervention or just through prompts, then what are designers are supposed to do? Yeah. We can't compete against, like a machine system. So I think design we're starting to realize we can collaborate with AI, but that means that design is going to have to push itself upstream. Right. It's going to have to, because if we don't push ourselves upstream to things that can't be systematized through an algorithm, and this is also happening in engineering. So one of the biggest questions I got in these college nights when I would go is that parents said, tell me that my child isn't going to be out of a job in 5 years because of AI. I got that question the most. And I said, how do I answer that? So I turned it on them. I said, what do you do? Well, I'm an engineer. Right. So I said, engineering can be systematized. So your job can be just as automated as design. In fact, it can be even automated easier than design, because design is idiosyncratic, where engineering is about logic and about gravity and about, algorithms and rule sets or whatever. So actually, I said to them, your job is probably going to be much more at risk than a designer because of the logic of your discipline. Medicine, we're seeing it in medicine. We're going to see it in law. We're going to see essentially the algorithmization of those professions. Right. And they're going to have to move themselves upstream too. Right. Law and medicine. So I'm pessimistic, but because I'm a designer, I'm an optimist. And so it's like I'm perpetually frustrated, or what my friend calls a pissed off optimist. That's how I sort of liked it when I heard it. I said, yeah, I'm a pissed off optimist. I have anger, but I have this incredible sense that we can make tomorrow better than today. And that's what I hope for all of you. And you're getting a world that's totally screwed up. And it's screwed up because of us. But guess what? You're going to fix some of the things. But guess what? You're going to screw up things. And when you have kids, they're going to be angry at you, just like you should be really angry at us. I mean, what type of world did you give us? Because now we're behind the 8 ball.
Yeah. Just to close out now, that's a nice note to end on. Thank you, Adam, for joining us. We learned so much from you, and I think our audience definitely learned so much too. And again, once again, just thanks a lot for coming.
And thank you very much for the opportunity. I've learned a lot today myself.